Okay, well, thanks so much for joining us for the show today. We have a special guest, Marty Solomon, joining us today for our time. Originally from Southern Idaho, he holds a bachelor's degree in Christian Ministries from Boise Bible College. Marty apprenticed under the teaching of Ray Vanerlaan, host of That the World May Know. Some of you may have seen that. He's traveled with him both to Israel and to Turkey, researching biblical history and context. Marty now lives in Cincinatti with his family, where he serves as the president of Impact Campus Ministries and the creator and executive producer of the BEMA Podcast. Some of you may have heard of that as well. Marty, great to have you on the show. Joining us as well as Christian. Good to have you here.
What's up? Thanks.
Yeah. We're going to be diving into a bunch here about discipleship, about the content you've been doing, with BEMA. Is it BEMA? BEMA? How do you pronounce it?
We've always said BEMA, and then a little ways into it, because that's what I remember hearing from Ray. And I don't know what the difference is between the modern Hebrew and the biblical Hebrew, but somewhere along the way we found out we were maybe wrong, and we just went with it. Okay. We were just like, it's okay. It probably should be BEMA. But so you'll hear me say all kinds of things, just kind of whatever. So you can't get it wrong. Because it's
okay. So basically, even if you get it wrong, just because it's sort of deep in your brain, because I've listened to the podcast, and so many of my friends do as well. And in my sort of ecosystem, it's BEMA for some reason. So I'll just say BEMA. Apologies in advance that I'm butchering something, most likely.
So there's no butchering. It's just fantastic. I accept it all. It's great.
We'll get into all of that here today. It should be a great conversation. But I wanted to start with just a little bit of your spiritual background. And I thought it would be good just to kind of hear from you. How did you come to start following Jesus? And what's been some of your spiritual journey into that path?
Yeah, I've been raised in the evangelical church my whole life. And by the time I was born, my parents were going to church. I have Jewish heritage in my family. I was not raised with that. It's kind of a weird. My story is a weird one. It's just a mashup of all kinds of interesting things. My father's family is very strict and devout LDS, a Mormon family, and so because of that. My dad has some genealogical records through the Mormon church that I was able to get my hands on for some school projects back in junior high and high school. And through that, I kind of had this awareness of the Jewish roots that we had through our, we had been in Cornwall, England for at least 1,000 years. We hardly changed addresses at all. And so I kind of knew about that, but wasn't raised in it. I was raised in a pretty fundamentalist Christian evangelical upbringing. My mom loved Focus on the Family, Dr. James Dobson, and that was my experience growing up. And I was just always in church. I was a good student athlete. I kind of did everything by the book. I was going to go play football and study law and go to political science, and God pulled me, called me, compelled me, whispered to me. I don't know what it is, but he pulled me to ministry. I went to Bible college instead. Went through the typical, just kind of had my own angsty crisis of faith in my early 20s. It wasn't working for me. All the theology, all of the things that they were handed to me. So somebody handed me some different teachers. It was Rob Bell before the freak out heresy days, where everybody was such a provocative figure, and he really was.
Oh, I remember that. Yeah. Was intense.
The Numa days, and so I was watching, and through that I got connected to Ray. I was raised on Ray, but wasn't really conscious of who Ray was, and so my journey's been just like always. I've never had a point or a chapter in my life where I didn't know Jesus. I was raised in a Reformed tradition, so a sprinkled infant baptism.
Right.
I went to Bible college, got immersed at that point. Like, at which point in my journey was I don't know. Jesus has always been a vibrant part of my life, and he's led me to brand new chapters all along the way. And so it's a weird way to answer that question. In some ways, an uninteresting story, in other ways, a crazy story. So, but yeah, that's it.
It sounds like the intersection of you and Ray, right? Like when that connection happened, and you kind of started even, following him into Israel or Turkey, that was a shift. There was a shift in the direction of how you even viewed Christianity or how you viewed following Jesus. Maybe you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, and I hate to always. I'll be honest. I'll just be more. I'll be honest on your podcast. How about that? I hate to keep bringing up the name because everybody freaks out so much, but I would say my consciousness really shifted with Rob. In those days, Rob was articulating the gospel in ways that I just needed to understand. I needed to hear, and it was rooted in a more Jewish Second Temple Judaism, historical, critical hermeneutic. And that wasn't what I was handed in Bible college. That's okay. I've gotten over the frustration that I had from those years, but he was handing me something new. And it was through that if I was going to learn it, I was going to learn it under Ray. And Ray had connections with our local church. And so that's where I got connected to him. You were kind in my introduction. You said I apprenticed under him. He may not remember it quite the same way. I was just a punk in the back of all of his groups that was learning and just devouring. I had recordings of all of his teachings, and I would just listen to them over and over and over again, and then go back then he had more set of teachings. And so Ray was the trip is what lit a fire in me. Like, my consciousness shifted years before that when I went and saw it and experienced it in person. Yeah, that was where my passion for discipleship took off, and where I wanted to start implementing this in some kind of ministry. And
I can really identify with the whole Rob Bell thing, and obviously this thing, things shifted, right? But I remember I had that same exact influence from him. I was like, this is a missing link. I know this is a missing link. There's this almost like this drop off in Christianity that basically nothing existed before Jesus came along, but Jesus was speaking out of millennia of experience and knowledge and understanding and commentary and context. And Rob Bell was, maybe I was just limited in my studies, but that was the one guy who was digging into that and connecting the two worlds. And to me, that was just transformative. I think it was fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. That was my experience as well. In a lot of ways, saved my faith, because the handles I was being handed weren't working for me, and I didn't know. But he was saying stuff, and I'm like, okay, if Jesus is that, I can. Where is this Jewish thing coming from? Give me more of that. What's going on here? And so that was my gate. That was my gateway, and it really was a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I remember when I caught one of your lectures in Seattle about a year ago, and you told this great story about being in Jerusalem, and I think it was following Ray around, and the fence interaction, like there was
yeah.
Maybe you could tell us that story. It was such a great story, an illustration of kind of the light bulb moment of discipleship.
Yeah, he was trying to teach us what rabbinical discipleship looked like in the first century, and this whole concept of whatever the rabbi does, you do. And it was this fantastic teaching moment that I try to duplicate in different ways on my own trips when I take students. But I can't remember where we were at. I think we might have been outside Tel Gezer. I'm not sure. But we were traveling along. There was a barbed wire fence, kind of slightly dilapidated. And we come up to it, and Ray gets down on his belly, and he crawls underneath the barbed wire fence. Now, maybe 20 yards to our right, the fence has fallen down. We could just walk over it. So we all kind of looked at each other, kind of exchanged glances, and then we just went over to where the fence was down and walked over the fence and kept following him. He let us walk, I don't know, 3/4 of a mile. And then he turned around and did the lesson of a rabbi always has a reason for doing what he does. Your job as a Talmud is to mimic and imitate the rabbi, because the rabbi, everything, every movement, every word, every decision, every gesture. You see, in our culture, you have to be yourself. Like, plagiarism is bad, and it is bad. Mimicking people is not. That's like conformity. You have to be an individual. In their world, in the rabbinical world, you had to follow. You had to follow whatever the rabbi did. So he was trying to impress this upon us. He said, "I'll just stay here. I'm going to let the whole group go back, and you can all crawl underneath." It was like 117 degrees that day. We went back.
That's great.
Underneath the fence, came back, and it was just awesome. This fantastic lesson. And he would reinforce it throughout the trip in different ways. I can remember the second time he taught it was a couple days later. He was walking by, and he picked up like a softball-sized rock, and he carried it like half a mile, and half of us caught it. Yeah. We picked up our own rocks. Some of us picked up little rocks, and some of us picked up big rocks and whatever. And then he stops and he said, "Anybody have your rock?" And about half of us did. And he's like, "Oh, good. Half of you learned the lesson. I came by here once, and there was a dog in that house that about came out and killed me. So now I have a rock with me in case the dog comes." He's all, "Don't you want to be like your rabbi?" So we were like, "Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, this is good."
That's great. I love that story.
That's fantastic. That's a great
story. Covered in the dust of your rabbi.
Yeah. Oh gosh, so much dust, so much sweat, so much blood. Oh,
yeah,
it was great.
Well, how did that, coming back from that experience and then back into Western American Christianity and church culture, and how did that begin to inform some of your spiritual formation and the journey from that point on?
Well, it's what ended up driving me into campus ministry. It would take about 2 to 3 years before I figured that out. I used to pastor a small church in Boise, Idaho, when I was in Bible college. I did that for 6-7 years. And then I got out of that thinking I was going to go. I was all into the emerging church. I was going to go change the world through house churches and do all this other stuff. And that didn't work. That lasted for about 3 months before I knew I needed to get back into ministry. But I was such a jerk back then that I had burned every bridge I knew. So I just kind of went waddling into this, back to my home church, into this position as a missions director, evangelism and missions director. And just had this, I had a job description. I had a role that I was supposed to play. And I came back with this experience of first century rabbinical discipleship. And I was like, this would still work. If we did this today, this would still change the world. Like, it changed the world. It changed human history with 11 guys and a handful of ladies. Like, this would still change human history if we did this. And I'm not knocking the church I worked for, but they were just like, yeah, but it's not in your job description. Like, you run these programs, you do this stuff. Like, and I understand that. And these were Ray people. Like, they knew that about. And, and they did have a passion for that. They just also they were from a denominational background. They had a church that needed to do certain things, and I was hired to do some of those things. I get that. But I started and they were very gracious. They said, we know that this isn't your long-term, like, you'll be going somewhere else, and we want to help you figure out what that is. And when I resigned from that first church, Impact Campus Ministries had asked me to do campus ministry. And I was like, A, I don't want to raise my own funds. B, I don't want to do youth group for big kids. So no way. And then they asked me again when I went to Twin Falls, and I was like, no, I'm just not interested. And I am lamenting one of these days as I'm trying to figure out what my future holds. And I'm like, God, I just need some people. They need to be adults because they need to be able to make their own decisions. Like, they can't be like, their parents can't get in the way, but I also need them to not have mortgages and marriages and 3 kids and a career. And I went, oh my goodness, it's college students. Yeah. And that's what drew me into campus ministry was this. I came back and didn't know where to put it in the church at large. And yeah, it's been a wild ride. It's been fantastic.
It's great. And so take us from there to the BEMA podcast, and how did that emerge?
Yeah. So I'm a teacher by giftedness. So my passion was discipleship. My giftedness was teaching. And so I had this body of work that I had picked up from these trips with Ray, and Ray had taught me who to study and like gave me his bibliography, and here's what you need to understand, and here's what you need to look for, here's what you need to be careful of. So I had been given these tools, and I had been building this body of work, and And I knew that my giftedness was teaching, so I knew that my approach to campus ministry was going to be somewhat teaching centric. So I created a program where we'd bring college students in, and college students were already hungry to deconstruct their faith. So why not deconstruct the Bible while being passionate and centered on the Bible? So let's deconstruct some of that and put it back together and reconstruct it. And so we created a class, and that flavor of our ministry we called BEMA, and it was a 2-year program. Students would come in, and by the time they got through 2 years, they would have gone from what is today session 1 through 5, and then we would go to Israel. I would take the students over to Israel and Turkey, and we would go on a study tour together. And then if they had any time left, we would come back and we would try to live in some kind of intentional community together. And it was just a great experience. And what happened at that point was they asked me to serve as president for Impact, and I couldn't be at class anymore. And so it wasn't me trying to be a genius. It was just me going, if I can't be in class, but I still want to have a discussion group when I'm in town, I'll put my content in a podcast and people can access it. I wasn't trying to be, a flipped classroom. I wasn't trying to be deeply philosophical. I just thought this would be a practical. And so we did. And then more and more people started listening to it. And then all of a sudden I was on a podcast like this one, and that got somebody interested, and boom, the rest is history. It was crazy. So it's been a while.
You guys are up to somewhere around 4 million downloads at this point, right? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, we passed 4 million. I don't try to get too wound up in the data points, sure. But Brent told me we passed 4 million data point or downloads last week. We're coming up on about 8,000 daily downloads. So, which is just crazy. I'm trying to figure out how to just steward that well. Whatever God's doing, whatever gift this is, that God's wanting to do through all of us, not just us, but just trying to steward it.
So clearly, this is my interesting thing. So clearly, this is an organic thing, right? Like, I mean, this is a growth that you probably wouldn't predict when you were originally doing it. You were just trying to create a vehicle for you to express some things and have them stored for someone to learn, whatever. Tell me how you see it, because I mean, obviously, I was influenced by. I'm still very much influenced by this connection of the view of continuity, right? Mm-hmm. That Jesus didn't come out of a vacuum, and that matters, and that it would inform the way we operate, think, et cetera, et cetera. And in my mind, it's one of those things that isn't this obvious, right? Isn't this incredible and beautiful and an integrated view of life and discipleship and the Christian life, and yet it pushes against a very, very different cultural context, right, in the general population, when you saw it. And yet, so it's countercultural, and yet clearly there's a need.
Right.
Because otherwise so many people wouldn't be downloading it, sharing it with friends, doing group studies of BEMA, and that's what's happening. Tell me what is this? What's this hunger, this pain point, that it's resonating with people in BEMA?
Yeah. And I'm probably not smart enough to really talk about it super effectively. I know that we've built, especially in the Western world, and maybe even more so in America, the North American, but especially the American context, we've built a machine, an evangelical church system. And oftentimes we've built that on the foundations of our traditions and expressions that have been built on just different historical eras of Western development, and that's worked in large parts at different points in history, at different chapters. But time just continues to move, and the world changes. And ever since the French Revolution, we've been in this awkward post-Christian kind of fighting this weird war that, and it's raised questions. It's made people think. You throw the internet into that, my goodness, the ability to find them. We're living in an information, like you used to find all your grounding in the tradition you were a part of, the expression of faith that you were tied to. And now the challenge is to not throw out all those babies with the bathwater. Like, those things are still deeply meaningful, but all these intellectual questions which kind of got filtered just through that tradition, are now filtered through the ability to actually find some answers to those questions. And so I think, I try not to be too critical about this. I don't know if evangelicalism has been working for a while. And I think we all kind of know that on some level. It doesn't mean it's all broken and bad. It just means there's been something that's been a little off. And we have a commitment to the scriptures. And so we know that we want to be rooted and grounded in that. And so that's where we've been going to reevaluate. Like, is the thing that's off? I heard one pastor once talk about the world, the word we live by, the work we're called to, and the world we live in. And so is the thing that's off? Is it in the world? Is it as we perceive the world? Is it in how we understand our work? Or is it how we understand our word? And I think especially American Christians have said, well, it's definitely not the word. We got that figured out a long time ago. So we've been all wrestling with work and world. And yet now we're starting to realize, oh man, there's all kinds of other things that open the word up and make it more right. And it transcends all these denominational expressions, and it transcends. And so, I think it's just, I think I started to ramble at some point in there.
Well, okay, so
real great, Christian.
The rambling does lead me to a question. Okay, so here's my question. You mentioned this post-Christian thing that's happening, right? And it's really fascinating because we have more information than ever. The information revolution has changed the world, and the fragmentation continues, right? Because you have access. You can be in an ecosystem of whatever denomination. 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, you sort of stayed in the ecosystem, right, for objective reasons. But because of the media connections, phones, and every high-speed internet, all of those things, now you see the world outside of your ecosystem so much more easily. So it fragments and sort of tweaks, and you can, as you said, you can throw the baby out of the bathwater because you're confused. But here's my other question. The other side of this is the society in the United States is quickly sort of moving towards post-Christian culture, sort of following in the lead of Europe, Western Europe specifically. And then what you say, and I think what we say in general collectively in the Christian world, especially if we include sort of this didn't come out of a vacuum, and this is as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, etc. We have sort of these pearls of wisdom and understanding of the world, how it actually works in the laws of God, essentially, things that don't change. The faster things change, the more important it is to find things that don't change, right? Because you can root yourself in that. And those things, are about relationships, friendships, gender, leadership, money, all of those things. So as you speak what you speak from this rooted, integrated view of Scripture, can you tell me some of the things? How do you see the response of the post-Christian dimension of the world to what you say, especially in lieu of cancel culture? It's complicated. You know what I'm saying? What do you? Yeah. How do you see? How does BEMA bump against that and respond to it?
Yes, it's very complicated. And there's a lot of places that I would love to just run to. And yet I have been very intentional about occupying a different space. And by different, I don't simply just mean the middle. Sometimes we glorify just the middle for middle's sake. And I'm not trying to just sit in the middle. I want to sit in some kind of different space. That's limited by my own redneck vocabulary. Like, I'm still from Southern Idaho. I wasn't an Ivy League student. Like, you compare my stuff to like Bible Project, we are definitely not on that level. We are much less polished. We're a little bit more raw and weird. I'm weird. So sometimes what we're trying to do is limited by just me as a human being, but we are trying to occupy this space that's not left and it's not right. And I'm amazed at how people hear our stuff and interpret our stuff. I'm always amazed. Right. I did our last live stream Q&A, and no joke, I wish I would have saved and screenshotted the timestamps. 3 minutes after I got done with the live stream Q&A, an email comes into my inbox that says, the language you're using when you talk about this stuff makes you really sound like you're very liberal. 92 seconds later, I got an email from somebody that said, when you say those things that you said on the live stream, it makes you seem like you're complicit with conservative evangelicalism.
Right.
And I thought, my goodness, I just want to hand both of you these emails, and because that is largely the space that we're trying to occupy, to have a different conversation in a different space than, because it is weird. And how does the post-Christian world bump up against BEMA? Typically they love it because it's not this. I mean, if we do it right on our better days, it's not this tribal, we're the right team, come join our stuff.
Yeah.
We understand it all. It's more question based. It's inquisitive. It's willing to call out some things that might be a little wacky. And we try to be sensitive, like you mentioned, like cancel culture. Like there's still some things to learn from all that. Like there's this extreme expression of that's really problematic, but there are also some things to learn about that should be like basic Jesus principles, like respect for other people,
right?
Just the way that we talk about things and the way that we honor others. And I've had to learn about Jewish appropriation, and yes, and my theology has something to say about that, but as a Jesus follower, I should care deeply about Jewish appropriation and what that means. And so how can I let all this post-Christian culture stuff, it's not a war. How can I see it as a gift? It also doesn't mean I have to embrace it all, but I can learn from it and let it hopefully just take our conversation to a totally different place, a higher level that's not this and it's not that. So that's what I love that space. I find that to be very gospel-centric. I find it to be very, I call it Eucharistic community. Like it pulls people to a different center. Yeah. That center hopefully being Christ. And I want to be a part of that. So if I can learn from everything, if I can learn from everybody, then come on, I got some broken bread and I got some poured wine. So let's do it.
Yeah. Tim Mackey does this illustration with two circles, and then he has where they meet in the middle, right? And that's the third space, right? Heaven and earth.
Yep.
We're supposed to kind of live in that tension of, we're not just isolating ourselves to our communities and living in a bubble, a Christian bubble, but we're also not just, living on earth and just kind of mentally making the agreement with certain biblical truths. We're practicing this way of heaven on earth in that space, and it's meant to be that third space for people. Which I think your story about going back to your story of going to Jerusalem and seeing that and then coming back home, it kind of serves as a perfect illustration, right? Maybe we're a little bit more postmodern than at that time, because it seems to be the ball seems to be rolling pretty quickly in that direction. But I wonder too, as you're not just the postmodern world, but kind of the average church follower that is obviously paying attention to your content. What are you catching on to? What's missing in our worldview of discipleship that could help us get to that space, right? To that third space.
Yeah, it's probably a couple different ways I could answer that. At the end of our body of work, we talk about our 4 pillars. Like if I were to talk practically about what we're missing or what we could do, like that's my own just personal conviction and has been since my days with Ray. I kind of formulated those 4 pillars, as I just thought about my time with Ray. But the text and community and discipleship and wrestling are the 4 big ideas that I love to just come back to. We think we're really good on the text, but we're not. We're good on doctrine, and doctrine and text are not the same thing. And the Western world has we just want to know what the text says. So doctrine, we don't really actually want to get the text in us. And that's something different than what was happening in Jesus's day, where it was not about doctrine. Like doctrine's important, but it was about the text, because the text was the word of God that was powerful and never returned back void. And then there was like a radical commitment to community, which we don't have. We build up this tribal identity of us versus them. We go to culture wars. Um, discipleship, we call a lot of things discipleship, which are great things, and I don't have a problem. We even call them discipleship, but somewhere we lost rabbinical discipleship, the kind of discipleship I saw. And then we discourage wrestling in the church because we see it as a threat largely. So, but if I were to the second way I would answer that question is I would go back to something Christian just said a moment ago, which was, there, what we actually end up deconstructing is all of this, this doctrinal house of cards that we've built, and sometimes glued together, like it's even a strong house of cards. But what actually the foundation of it is wisdom. Like, what we're missing is something more real than the systems we've built out to the wisdom. It's the wisdom that it's built on itself, like wisdom being Christ as the Logos, wisdom being the teachings of Jesus, but we always race ahead to the application of that wisdom. But the problem is the application of the wisdom will only be vibrant for a certain season of history. And then all of a sudden stuff changes and humanity changes and my context changes. And we always cry out relativism, but that's not, no, wisdom is the absolute truth. The application is relative, but we always make the application the truth. And so I feel like whenever you start tapping into the wisdom of the Christ, well, now all of a sudden people are Christians everywhere. Dare I say non-Christians everywhere? Well, they're interested in that. They can smell that coming a mile away. They want to be in on that. And it's not just an intellectual wisdom. It is that, but it's just so much. It's relational wisdom.
Yeah.
It's vocational wisdom. It's how are we putting the world back together? God is repairing and restoring the world, and he's looking for partners. And we all want to be a part of that. Believer or non-believer, there's something about us that we're literally made to do that. And so we're drawn towards that. But instead of tapping into that, we use it as a tool to our ends to try to build our little mini empires. And
even sort of the some of the things that sort of bump against Christianity that come from sort of a space of social justice, I think that's the deepest underlying thirst, is that we are worshipers. We're created to minister to this earth. We're created to bring the kingdom, and it's just interpreted as isolated from the Father who gave us this thirst in the first place.
Yeah.
And then it becomes this weird war or, tug of war.
Yep.
And it shouldn't be, because it comes from the exact same place. Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mark Sayers has this saying. He says, we want the kingdom without the king.
That's exactly what it is.
We're trying to build this utopia without the sovereignty and lordship.
But then Christians double down, and we're like, I want the king, but not the kingdom.
Right.
And there's this weird, again, it's that overlapped space. It's that sacred overlap of, okay, but in the middle, that's where God's at. Right. But God's people are over here, not God's people are over here doing their, but God's in the middle going, I could use both of you if you'll just come hang out here and let's build the kingdom together.
Well, tell me, Marty, I know that part of you had shared earlier at the beginning that you had kind of made this invigorating, I don't know how you said it, you kind of journeyed back into your Jewish heritage even, right? And that we're talking about going back to Jesus and back to the wisdom and back to context, and what worked 2,000 years ago still applies today. And yet there's very much a divide for, I think, most people, at least in the Western world, of what it means to be a Christian. They don't think a Jewish rabbi and discipleship, right? So how did you kind of make that journey as a Christ follower back, and what were some of the tensions that you faced even in that, and how'd you navigate some of that?
Yeah, that was a really weird experience. I don't talk about it much, but here we go on your podcast. I had been with Ray for some time, and when you start getting into this this kind of teaching, whatever we mean by that, this kind of teaching, it becomes very trendy to have people that, I want to be Jewish, I want to celebrate the festivals, I want to eat kosher, I want to,
Right.
and it was so important. Like I had learned under Ray, he had done a very good job of passing on at that point what was relatively new, the new perspective of Paul, School of Theology. Like it had been out for a decade or two, but it was still being refined. But he had the things we were learning from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the things that we were learning from guys like N.T. Wright and E.P. Sanders and Mark Nanos and James Dunn. Like he had passed it on to me. The importance of Gentiles are Gentiles, Jews are Jews, and the entire scandal of your New Testament is that in Christ they're together in this united Eucharistic community. That's what your whole New Testament is about. So I had learned that. And I had come back from all these trips when I was teaching, and people would get wound up about Judaism, and I would tell them, no, we can't be Jewish because we have to be the Gentile Christians that God called us to be. We have to know, we have to plant our feet in the history of the scriptures. We have to know where we have to appreciate, we have to honor the Judaism that we come out of, but our job is not to become Jews. That ruins the gospel. And so then I go over to it was my last trip with Ray, and I had grown out I'm going to tell you this story. I never tell this story. I had grown my beard out just to be stupid. No reason, just to be dumb. Haven't shaved it since. I had grown my beard out. I walked into the airport and I turned the corner and I saw Ray and I went to greet him, and he stepped back and he went, "Oh my goodness, you're Jewish." And I went, that's kind of a weird, like I said, I knew I had Jewish heritage, but that's a weird thing to say to somebody. He grabbed my name tag and he said, "Has your name always been spelled that way?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, since for 1,000 years out of Western Europe." He's like, "We've never seen that name come out of Western Europe and have it not be Jewish." And I'm like, okay, the more you know. Like, what does this have to do with anything? The first few days of the trip, Ray, whenever he talks about Jews, Ray points at me from across the way. He's like, "If you were to ask a Jew today," and I'm like, what? Or if he's standing next to me, he'd put his hand on my shoulder. Like, Jews today would tell you, and I'm like, what is going on? It was day like 4 or 5. We're coming back from the Jordan River, and somebody is asking Ray a question, and they refer to me as their semi-Jewish friend. And Ray loses his mind. He calls everybody over. He says, "I don't want to hear anybody ever call him that ever again. If you're a Jew, you're a Jew. There's nothing you can do about it. And if you're not a Jew, you're not a Jew, and there's nothing you can do about it." And he gave this big old, and I just stood there like, I had never applied the theology that I had been teaching. And I met Ray back at the bus, and I'm like, "Ray," and he's like, "Listen," he was gracious. He was like, "In Jesus, I think you have all the freedom in the world. Obviously, you haven't been raised in your Judaism, and in Jesus and in Christ, it's grace. It's all grace upon grace." But he's all, "I know what you teach, and you're going to have a student one day that's sharp enough that they're going to look at you and they're going to go, if that's what you believe the New Testament teaches, why don't you eat kosher? And you just need to know what you're going to tell them." And I was like, and I went home and had this really awkward conversation with my wife, and we prayed. We read through Torah 3 times. We wrote down every law we could find in Torah. We talked about the implications of what it means to become Torah observant. She prayed about it for some time. I told her I wanted it to be her decision, and I'd figure out what Jesus was doing with me after that. But I wanted her to. We were just starting to have kids. She didn't sign up for this, and she came back and said, "Yeah, I think this is what we should do." And so we just have been on this journey of, okay, and we were moving anyway. It was a great time, and we became Torah observant. We reclaimed that Jewish heritage that we understand from written Torah is passed on paternally. Jews don't see it that way today. It's been this wild journey. Did I get it right off the bat? No. It's been years of learning how to do it better and better and better, and learning how to honor modern Judaism through that, and learning, like, am I Messianic? Am I not Messianic? Like, why is it different?
Right.
But that's also just life. Life is just a big, constant evolving adventure and development. And so it's cool. We're doing the best. We're running after Jesus, and we're reading the scripture to the best of our ability.
Yeah. And
trying to live in a way that's consistent to that. So that's what I would hope everybody would want to do. Give me Bible, give me Jesus, and let's go.
Yeah. Love it. Well, it's been a great conversation. I've really appreciated it. I think one of the things that, as we kind of wrap up, one of the things that I know is near and dear to your heart is context, right? And getting the word into us, and how much getting context right matters, right? Because especially in just the history of the U.S., we've built all kinds of branches of Christianity out of getting context wrong, right? What's one practical thing that, as followers of Jesus, as somebody listening to this today, maybe who's not even following Jesus, but just wants to understand more about this contextual place that this rabbi taught from 2,000 years ago, what's one thing we can do to make that journey?
Well, it is a big, long journey, and I'm not sure if there's one small. The journey will start with just one small little step, but there'll be another one after that, and another one after that. I'm not sure if there's one thing that we can do that will make the difference that we need, but just learning to ask the question of, what did this mean? If the proper hermeneutic, if the Bible is inspired, and the proper hermeneutic to interpret this inspired text is about the conversation taking place between the author and the audience, we need to start asking that question, not as an afterthought and not as a somewhere later in the exegesis, but before I begin the exegesis, to have done the work to know what's the conversation taking place between the author and the audience. What is the history? What is the context? And if we start that earlier in the hermeneutical process, that's just going to go a long way. Now, that's just going to take a whole lifetime of learning and listening and studying. And if people want to know, like, well, what's the first step? I love Lois Tuerberg's books. Lois Tuerberg, Tverberg, looks like Tverberg, but Lois Tuerberg wrote 3 books about Rabbi Jesus, sitting at the feet of Rabbi Jesus, walking in the dust of Rabbi Jesus, reading my Bible with Rabbi Jesus. And she has some of the best material that is so wonderfully accessible for somebody that doesn't know anything. Like, if you want a place to start there, and then kind of take off from there and keep studying. And not everybody's a teacher, so not everybody's going to be a student but if we start learning how to ask a different set of questions, that will be the most. Just start from a different place, start with a different set of assumptions, start with a different initial question, and that's going to make.
I have a follow-up question. For those who feel that pull, right? You described that pull, like there's something missing. And this is, and I felt a very similar pull, actually. And Robel, before sort of he went theologically in a interesting direction, was a huge help for me. And it's sort of pulling on a thread, and then that leads you to other threads, etc. And I think for me, as someone who leads a church, I love this. I love sharing it. I love sort of immersing myself in it. And there's an environment, I think, where, for example, in Tribe, where both Elias and I serve, where this is a lot of this is happening in discussion, etc. But there are other environments, the one that you describe, where people go, "Oh, this is just weird," right? So what would you say to someone who is in the beginning of unpacking this whole dimension, just discovering this whole dimension to biblical culture, who doesn't have the environment? How do you navigate that? How do you not shut that down in yourself because it's so life-giving to you? But also, how do you not overreact and just walk up to the pulpit in the middle of service, says, "We're all lost. We've lost our way. I know the way." That kind of thing. I'm exaggerating, obviously, right? But the dynamics of that are very real, right? What would you say to someone like that, maybe who's listening?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to constantly remind myself and remind others that not everybody is in that place. And I trust the Holy Spirit. This isn't the only way that you're going to get to Jesus. This isn't the only way that the kingdom's going to come. This isn't the only way. Studying this and understanding this Jewish stuff isn't the key or the secret. The Holy Spirit's going to work in spite of us, just like he always did for centuries and centuries before we dug all this stuff out of the dirt and knew any of this stuff. So he's been working for the last 1,800 years. He'll keep working anyway. But there are some people that their expressions and their faith traditions and their doctrine, whatever, it works for them. And they're not asking questions about, this doesn't work for me. They're not looking for that. And that's okay. That's where they're at. And they don't, and what they've got is working just fine for them. But then there's everybody else. And it's if they're looking, if they're asking, they're typically ready. If they're not looking and not asking, I've watched all kinds of people try to cram BEMA down people's throats. That ain't going anywhere. They are not smelling what we're cooking, and that is okay. And that's I mean, the next layer of that difficulty is that you end up kind of like, you were with somebody and then you ended up in kind of like a different place, and then you start to go on this journey and you can't bring all these other people with you, and that's unbelievably unsettling because you can't make them come with you,
right?
But nor can you deny yourself this thing that God's teaching you. And so it's just, that's the nature of relationships too. It's not Christian or not Christian or in the church or out of the church or lost their way or found. Like, it's just the nature of growing and developing. And just like it was when we were physically developing, it's awkward and our voice cracks and we lose relationships and we have a girlfriend that dumps us. Yeah. And that just keeps happening throughout our life and the church, throughout our experiences in ministry in the church. And and it's okay because Jesus is still at work there and the Holy Spirit's still doing incredible things in all those spaces. Our job is to just steward the chunk of dirt that God's given us to steward and do it to the best of our ability. And when we're pastors like yourself, Christian, it's even more complicated because your flock is full of all those different people, all those different sheep. And you got to figure out how to steward them and occupy all these spaces and get your flock to water. And but Jesus is, he will sustain us. We are but hired hands, and he is the good shepherd, and it will be all right.
Hey to the man. That's great.
The man. Okay, I know we said we were going to let you go, but just what you said made me think about this idea of training and apprenticeship, and kind of that being a fundamental shift for, I think, almost everybody, right, that they can make into seeing themselves as a follower who is apprenticing, right? We're learning, we're training ourselves. We're learning to be trained by our rabbi on some level. And so I just wonder if you could speak to that a little bit about, when you think about, I mean, Jesus says things like, the student is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher, right? That there's this spectrum of training that we all kind of fall into somewhere. I don't know that any of us are fully trained, right? But we're somewhat trained. Or how does that fundamentally change your relationship with Jesus when you see yourself beyond just culturally a Christian or going to church or emotionally connecting with God through worship, but no, I'm actually here to train to become like somebody. How, even for you personally, how has that fundamentally changed your relationship with Jesus, and what does that offer to people?
I'm not sure there's anything in my life that ever caused me to be transformed more than pursuing that kind of discipleship. Nothing caused more growth. There's always somebody in front of you, and there's always somebody behind you. Always. No matter who we are, there's always somebody in front of you, and there's always somebody behind you, which means there's always somebody that you can be looking towards, because hopefully they're following Jesus. So, I mean, some 19 times in the New Testament, the writers of the New Testament talk about follow me, imitate me. We gave you an example to follow, some kind of like imitation language. So there's always somebody that should be looking like Jesus, more like Jesus in some way than I am. And so I want to be modeling that, imitating that as they imitate Christ. There's always, I don't care how new of a believer, I don't care how dumb you are, there's always somebody behind you, somebody that you can be looking at and going, I'm no Apostle Paul, but I would love to be able to imitate me as I imitate Jesus. Doesn't mean you have to have your whole life, but there's this little part of my life that I want to imitate for you, and you can follow me as I follow Christ. And nothing will will, I think, if you're a spirit-filled follower of Jesus, nothing will convict you more than knowing there's somebody 2 steps behind you, getting covered in your dust, watching your decisions, imitating wanting to know why you're making the decisions you're making. Nothing causes you to take that seriously than knowing somebody is trying to become like Jesus behind you. And so, yeah. And for us at Impact, that's just about know what it means to create space for God. Know what it means to have spiritual practices and spiritual disciplines. Know what it means to pray. Know what it means to memorize the text. Know what it means. Do something that you know what it means to run after Jesus. And then don't do that in your quiet time alone. Do that with somebody behind you. Do that with somebody and say, I'm going to memorize my text. Are you memorizing your text? I'm going to pray. Are you praying? Come follow me while I pray. Do that in front of somebody and then teach them why and how and what the struggles are, and then teach them how to do it for somebody else, and just keep the process going. It changed the course of human history. There's no better leadership development, not seminary, and seminary is wonderful, not church small groups, and church small groups are wonderful. Nothing is better than come follow me as I follow Jesus. You don't do that at an hour on Thursday morning at Starbucks, although hours at Thursday morning at Starbucks are great. There's something unique about, hey, I want you to come follow me. I want you to live some life with me. I want you to do what I do, not because I've arrived. I'm not Jesus, but let's get more like Jesus together.
Yeah. And I love that can't happen outside of community, right? Like we can't ingest enough content, enough podcasts, enough sermons to get there. We need people to walk with us. We need one another relationships. We need a community that we're bought into and that is bought into us, and we're doing it together.
Absolutely. You cannot have a personal relationship with Jesus without you've got to be doing this thing corporately with other believers together. 110%.
Love it. Well, what's next for you in the journey with BEMA or BEMA? What's the next steps? Where are you guys heading now?
We're gonna head into session 6. We're 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks by the time this episode posts into session 6. That's a bunch of guest interviews, kind of like what you're doing with me. We're doing it on our podcast, and maybe I'll have to have you guys on. And then we're doing some deeper dives, midrash, prophets, character studies. We're doing a whole. We're going to go through the Chosen series and like do an episode at a time and just give our own like commentary and thoughts on the Chosen series.
Oh, that should be fun.
Big crowd pleaser there. And then we've got. We're just going to keep making resources. We're going to expand the teaching team a little bit, so it's not just Marty. We need to get some other voices in there. So we're going to bring in a couple voices, and Marty won't even be on some podcast. It'll be fantastic. And in the meantime, I'll keep making YouTube videos, and we're trying to make more video content. There's some rumors that I'm writing a book with some other possible stuff coming after that. I don't know. We'll see. But just trying to if we can steward this gift that God's giving us and get more Jesus and more kingdom in the hands of people, if we can teach us how to ask good questions and turn the Holy Spirit loose, we'll be okay. So we're just going to keep seeing what God hands us and try to steward it well.
That's great. Well, where can people go to find out more? Where can people follow?
Yeah, so we're on. I try to be on social media platforms, and I don't use them for anything dumb. I use them just to promote information. So, spread stuff and podcast and that kind of thing. So, we're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. BEMA is on Facebook. I'm on Twitter at Marty Solomon. _BEMA is the Twitter account there. I'm on Instagram. You can find us at BEMAdiscipleship.com as our website. Basically, anything you need to get to, you can get to at BEMAdiscipleship.com. Find me on YouTube, whatever works. Awesome. People know how to find folks. Find me.
That's right. Well, Marty Solomon, awesome. It's been great to have this conversation with you. Thank you for the time, and we'll have to do it again.
Absolutely, guys. It's been an awesome conversation, so I look forward to it.